Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first For a Better Web podcast of 2025. And I am delighted that joining me, Bruce Lawson, Technical Communications Officer for Vivaldi Browser, I have the amazing Stephanie Stimac, who works for Igalia. Hello, Stephanie.
Hi, Bruce.
Hey, and you're developer relations for Igalia, is that correct?
I'm I am technically well, I wear many hats. I'm a PM, but I also do communications and marketing, and a lot of that sort of falls into developer relations. I get to do all the things I love.
Yeah, basically that's what I do. I just called myself technical communications officer because if you're DevRel, somebody comes and says, "How do I do this in CSS?" And I think
Yeah.
I can't remember. So I'm very fond of Igalia, but it's quite possible that our listeners and viewer might not know them. It's an open source consultancy, but that
Yeah.
doesn't actually tell me very much. What does Igalia do?
So Igalia has multiple different teams that work on different areas of um in different areas of technology.
Hmm.
I can only really confidently speak about the web platform and our WebKit teams and our
Hmm.
Chromium teams, but I am in team support for the web platform, and what that means is people hire Igalia's web platform team to build platform features for the browser. And I don't think a lot of people realize that you can do that. You think that like Chrome or Edge or WebKit, Apple, or Firefox, they're the only ones who can build features for their browser, but actually you can hire Igalia to implement whatever CSS or HTML or JavaScript feature you need, and we will work. We're very experienced in the whole process of that. So from designing a feature and laying that out in a design document, and then trying to get buy-in from Google and Apple and all the major browsers in the standards community so that we can then take that to a standards body and get that implemented. And that's quite a long process.
Hmm.
And I think Igalia is, well, we're very good at doing that. And there's a lot of benefit to hiring us to implement those features. And then outside of the web platform, we do have teams that work on like multimedia and hardware and implementing things in the open source community in many other different spaces.
Wild. So, for example, if I wanted CSS Bruce layout, just for the sake of argument, it's a great name, folks. I could hire Igalia and your web platform team would write the C++ in Blink and WebKit and Gecko.
Yep.
All three of them.
Yeah. All three of them. We have engineers who are um, we have engineers who know all three of the major engines, and even outside of the three major engines, we have folks working on the experimental Servo browser in
Hmm.
Rust. So we have a very capable team, and we all know how to work with folks who work on Gecko and folks who work on Chromium and WebKit and move that process along.
So, presumably, it's like 700 people or something
Where? Who?
at Igalia.
It's actually much smaller than that. There's 150, maybe a little bit more than that, 150 people across the whole company. Our web platform team is only 22 people.
Wow. I always tease Brian Cardell, who's a colleague of yours and an old friend of mine, that you all sit around a bong and play tambourine, because isn't it like a co-op and everybody gets to vote and everybody gets paid the same or something like that. I'm not asking you to divulge everything, but it seems like a really nice way to work.
It is, and it's a very different way to work because I spent 6 years at Microsoft in like full on corporate land, and
So Microsoft isn't sitting around a bong playing the tambourine. Gosh, who
no,
knew?
no. Um, and based on like some of my experiences at I don't want to come off saying like my experience at Microsoft was bad. It was not bad. I had
Mhm.
a wonderful manager. Like my manager changed a couple times, but I always had an incredible direct team around me. I know other people who did not have good experiences. I know people on Edge who had poor managers, like, and the way things were handled are much more political and bureaucratic. And coming into Igalia in this space where everyone is equal,
Mhm.
and you have to come in and trust that you're there for a reason. You go through a interview process to make sure that you have to be able to communicate with people and have a lot of empathy and understand their point of view, because there is no direct manager. Like
Mm.
if I have if I'm struggling with someone, or something's not going like as well as it could be, there's no higher up that I can go to. I have to talk to my mentor, and then it's very much like, how do we solve this together and get through it? And it's a very new experience. I will say the first time that I met everyone in person, we were having meetings, and everyone was we're having discussions and deciding on things together. And it was the first time in my 14-year career that I actually felt like everyone, even when they disagreed, they were doing so in a respectful manner.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
like to say that that's the first time in 14 years that I've experienced that is kind of incredible. And so after that first sort of in-person experience, I was like, this is actually really cool.
Mhm.
And I feel incredibly grateful and lucky that I get to experience this environment where everyone cares about each other and does want the best for the company. Because if we're all not working together and doing our best, then the company's not going to do best. So it is really great. And everyone's open to ideas, and you sort of have freedom to propose um, new initiatives or projects, and it's a lot of fun.
It sounds great. It sounds quite like Vivaldi, actually. I mean, we're 57 people. We all report to Yun, who founded it, but he's always said, many heads think better than one. I want your input. We can disagree, and it's such a refreshing change from the corporate side, and very open source. Because of course, all the browser engines you mentioned are open source. So
Mhm.
if I wanted CSS Bruce layout and I had infinite time and was able to code C++, I could go ahead and commit that stuff myself. But I'm guessing that people hire Igalia because you're a known entity, so the people who accept PRs in Blink and WebKit and Gecko, know of Igalia, and you know how the engines work. But who are your customers? Can you give me some examples of things you've implemented for a customer, and if it's possible, because I know there are corporate concerns, but
Mhm.
why would a customer pay for a CSS thing to be added? What's in it for them?
So I think Bloomberg is probably the best example
Hmm.
of a customer that I can talk about.
Sure.
And um, we've been working with them for a long time. And the example I always like to point to is that we implemented CSS Grid for them, and in its form that it exists today, like it's because of Igalia and because Bloomberg needed it for their terminal.
Mhm.
So most of what we do for CSS involves layout and trying to get stuff for them into their terminal. And there have been so many other things that I'm trying to remember off the top of my head now, but there's a huge list. I think Brian at Cardell has a post that details everything that we've done for them, but I believe we also implemented has for them.
Oh, I love has. CSS has, folks. Saved my life so many times.
Yeah. So, and then the most recent one that I can think of, it was just rolled back because there was an issue with CSS highlight inheritance. So that's something that was posted on the web.dev blog
Hmm.
that we implemented, but we just had to roll it back out of Chromium because it was conflicting with Tailwind CSS.
Oh,
And
I,
I speaking as a developer and not on behalf of Igalia, I find it fascinating that we would roll something back out of the web platform and not have it baked into the web platform because of a clash with a framework.
mhm.
And so we're trying to get that back into Chromium right now, but that's something else that we worked on.
This was to do with specificity and the inheritance, wasn't it? And it was doing something other than you'd expect. I'm no fan of Tailwind, but I suppose it's always been sort of an axiom of implementing new stuff on the web platform that you shouldn't break existing sites. So
Yeah, but it is something fascinating that I think about too, because I think about like all of the work being done to select and HTML form controls
mhm.
and all of the issues there and how long that's taken, because obviously you can't break the probably hundreds of millions of sites. I don't know if that figure is correct, but I'm guessing millions of sites that have select on
Mhm.
implemented on their site, and trying to improve select, you can't break any of that because some of those sites probably aren't maintained anymore.
Absolutely. It's quite humbling, isn't it? I remember when somebody was asking me, why does it take so long to implement something like, for example, Flexbox or Grid? This is a new paradigm. And I said, yeah, but somewhere in the world, somebody will try and use a CSS grid inside a CSS table that is floated inside an HTML table layout because that's what their CMS uses. And we have to think about all those possible permutations. You can't just pluck it out the air and implement it if it's like as you would if it's a proprietary language, Adobe
Mhm.
thing or Flash, for example. But so how does it work? Do Bloomberg or another customer come in and say, we've written a spec for CSS Grid, make it happen, Igalia? Or do they, how does it?
So in what I've experienced in my almost year at Igalia, typically they come to us and a customer comes to us and says, we want to be able to do this thing in CSS or HTML or JavaScript, whatever. And we typically are the ones who come up with the design document. There's possibly there may not even be a spec written for it
Mhm.
yet. And that's something else that the engineers at Igalia are very experienced in. So we have people updating specs. One of the things that we've also been working on, well, last year is trusted types in the
Hmm.
browser, and we've had folks making spec updates to that while working on getting that implemented in all three engines. So, and sort of navigating that. But you could come to us and say, there's a spec for this thing that we want already, but it's not complete, or it doesn't fully meet our needs, or we need it to be extended, and we work to make that happen. So there's different ways you can come to us.
Amazing. And you mentioned the three rendering engines, but when we started, you mentioned the experimental Servo engine, which I think came out of Mozilla originally. They started developing it and community-fied it. And is it
Mhm.
only Igalia who deals with it, or are you one of the contributors?
I would say so. We are one of the main stewards of it. We have the biggest team working on it.
Hmm.
And then we have had investments from companies that I can't disclose to help move that forward. And then on the other side of that, we also have a very active community of individual contributors. And I know some people in there have been paid by external companies to contribute to Servo, which is great. Even though we have I would say, the largest engineering team, and where we sort of lead the technical steering committee, it's very, very community involved. And actually, 2024 was a big year for Servo too. If you look at I think there's a blog post, but it's definitely on our socials. 2024 was the first year since 2018 that we actually matched and went above the number of commits from 2018. So there was a dip when
Hmm.
Mozilla stopped, when they abandoned Servo and basically handed it to Igalia, and we finally come out the other side of that dip, and now we are hopefully going to have more commits than last year. And so it's very actively being worked on.
Nice. And what's its status? I mean, could I take Servo and build a browser on it right now, and that would run modern websites, or is it still alpha, or I'm
So,
making up the terms?
so it's still marked as experimental. I don't know if alpha is the right term for it in its state. It's still missing, like, for example, you can't go to YouTube.
Hmm.
Um, Videos don't play. I think SVG support is also not there, or poor. So it's still missing some like big chunks that would make it competitive. We have had someone did fork Servo and built a browser shell on top of it, called Verso, that got picked up on Hacker News late
Okay.
last year and got quite a flurry of interest. Um, but the interesting thing with Servo is it's kind of like, in my opinion, it's an important project because like, browser diversity is good. You don't want one corporation sort of holding on to all the browser power. And but it's very dependent on outside interest and someone needing Servo. And so, because we are a consultancy, and while we would love to just be able to invest all of the time into Servo, we do need customers who want to use it for something to hire us to
Hmm.
keep working on it. And so it's this interesting balance of how much do we do with our own investment from Igalia to continue to move that forward, because it is an important project, versus trying to get those customers to pay for it.
And this allows me to segue neatly. And I should say, listeners, now I'm inviting Steph to speak as Steph rather than for Igalia, because I first met Steph last year now. I keep thinking it's this year, in October, for the State of the Browser conference in London, which I need to say that Vivaldi co-sponsored. And Steph gave the first talk of the day because she'd forgotten it was her wedding anniversary and had to run off and do a Romeo and Juliet. And the first talk of the day was great, and it really resonated with me, and I recommended it to loads of people. And it was about how do we fund open source, and how do we fund browsers? I mean, obviously browsers are a small part of open source, but it's the world I know best and work in. Because of course, recently the US judge has said that Google was a monopoly. Surprise, surprise. And there is talk of Google having to divest Chrome and Chromium, which of course powers Vivaldi, Edge, Opera, Brave, lots of other things. And also, that's the technology behind Node, Bloomberg terminals, etc. And Steph, you were painting a bleak, but in my opinion, accurate picture of the browser ecosystem. There are people making billions of browsers, but not investing that back. Could you briefly speak to that and sort of give us a précis of your talk? And I'll link to it in the show notes, folks.
Yeah. So I start the talk off comparing the browsers to the film Dune, because I think the comparison of browsers to Spice, if you're familiar with Dune, I won't give a whole explanation of what Dune is pretty accurate, because it's whoever controls the browser controls billions of dollars and access to information. And I tend to be a person who will think about what is the worst case scenario. And I think we have become, as a society, just so used to having access to the internet. It's right there. It's on our phone. I can just open it. And I don't necessarily, I think sometimes I personally forget that I am so embedded into the web and technology and browsers that some people don't necessarily know what a browser is. They just know that that's the internet. And so when you start to look at who actually controls and maintains our access to the internet, it's corporations. And that is scary, when you think about it. And in my view, it's by allowing corporations to sort of hold this, what I think is a human right, access to information and connection and the web.
Agreed.
If corporations are the ones maintaining this, we're sort of saying, well, you can't fail. What happens if you fail? Well, who's going to maintain our access that we have become so dependent on? In my talk, I say there's not a part of my day that is not touched by where I'm not interfacing, not interfacing with the web. My job's dependent on it. My bank is completely digital in the UK. I would not be able to go. I can't go to the Bank of Monzo. It is all on my phone. So I'm dependent on access to the web there. My bills, everything. So yes, my talk gets a little bit doomsday-esque, but also, are these companies too big to fail? Well, we have the Department of Justice saying, well, no, you're too big, so you need to get rid of Chrome or split it off, divest it, whatever. But all that money that Chrome generates, the number of the number of people who contribute back to Chromium, the biggest company who does that is Google. It's Chrome. If we lose those number of commits that team does every year. The sliver of multiple other companies, even Edge, like they're not contributing back in the same amount, like not even remotely the same amount. So what happens to that browser and the web, and how does it stagnate if we lose that?
100%. I mean, too big to fail, but I'm old enough to remember when the idea that Nokia or BlackBerry would disappear would be ridiculous. And somewhere I saw a stat that said of the top, the FTSE 100 or whatever it's called, of 1924, only 6 of those companies still exist now, or still exist doing the same thing, and are not just, a name on a incorporated in Delaware doing some nonsense. So companies do go. Is your concern that our access to the web or maintenance of browsers and browser engines is controlled by corporations per se, or is it that it's controlled by those particular corporations?
I think that's a good question. I think just corporations in general.
Mm-hmm.
I think because those ones are so big. And then we sort of get into the whole ethics of billionaires and the people who run those corporations, and this could be a whole other or podcast, but like, and not to do I want to go there? I'll go there. When we look at like what's happened with Twitter, the amount of control and influence just from a social media company, and then we have these tech companies who it's not just the browser, it's technology across a whole different range of areas and devices and everything. Again, the very anxious person in me who thinks about worst case scenario is like what is going to happen?
It's probably a mistake for an anxious browser person like me to speak to an anxious browser person like you. I'm going to have a lie down after this and just weep a bit. But can you imagine if Twitter controlled Chromium and called it Exium or Muskium or something like that? But it's a real concern, or it certainly concerns me. For better or for worse, Google do the lion's share of the work on Chromium, and if it were divested, would they continue to do so? And also, if it were divested, who would want to buy it? Because how would somebody generate revenue from Chromium that was forbidden by law from doing deals with Google search?
Mm-hmm.
This worries me. I have no particular love for Google, but I do have a love for an open source web browser engine. And also, like if in the EU and worldwide, Apple is forced to allow other browser engines onto iOS, would they still continue maintaining WebKit? I don't know. It troubles me sometimes that, I've been very actively fighting to open up iOS, but people do say, well, what happens then? And the question is, I don't know. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to fight an unjust monopoly, because the future could be worse, because it could be better. But oh God, I'm depressed now.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like my view of the U.S. government and is that oftentimes I feel like the people who are setting laws and sort of managing these lawsuits or trying to get TikTok banned or whatever. I've watched parts of the congressional hearings and everything, and you have a whole group of people who have no idea how any of this works,
Hmm.
making these decisions. And like you said, not that I am against sort of dissolving this monopoly, but the system that we have in place for funding browsers and funding the web is advertising. And I didn't quite realize until I had been researching my talk about this how much different browsers try to get you to stay in their browser because they want you to search. It never like because I'm still a Microsoft Edge girl. I use Edge. I'm still loyal to my old team. Um, but I never put two and two together until this last year and was like, oh, so Bing has actually gamified things so that you search, and with every search, you get points. And then with your points, you can redeem that for Starbucks cards or Amazon cards. And they do that to keep you in the browser so that you're searching and you get those ad hits. And I'm like, how did I never realize that like this was all just
I didn't realize that until you showed me, until I watched your talk, and then went and had a look and thought, wow, yeah.
yeah.
This is how important advertising is, and it's important to us at Vivaldi. You know, we have to make money. We can't develop a browser. You know, I was going to say I like paying my mortgage, but that's a lie. I like not sleeping out in the rain is probably more accurate. But yeah, ultimately, the money that comes through Lawson Towers and keeps me in champagne and caviar is advertising money.
Mhm. Yeah,
Commerce is, isn't it?
yeah, the system that we have in place. I mean, again, it is in case folks are listening and haven't seen my talk. I talk about how Google pays Apple for their placement, and it's like $5 billion or something,
20.
which is just also if you look at Apple's total revenue is like 20 billion. It's like even if you take the 5 billion away that Google is giving them, that is an atrocious amount of money. And so the system that we have in place has literally billions of dollars just like exchanging hands, but so little of that is actually going back into tech and the ecosystem and continuing to like help make it robust. And it's
So if you could wave a magic wand, because or a Igalia, a magic bong, if you could wave a magic bong and just solve the problem, what would you do? And this is Steph rather than Igalia.
I let's see, in an ideal world, I I think in my ideal world there would be some sort of, well, I don't know because I don't know if that would be ideal. It, I'm just gonna stream of consciousness sort of
Please.
what is going through my mind and whether or not that's actually a good idea. I don't know, but ideally there would be some sort of like organization that does not have corporate interests, that doesn't want to steal personal information or use your customers as the product,
Hmm.
that would sort of help ensure that browsers are continuously evolving and have funding, but then where does the funding come to that organization? Um, because that's the other thing about browser development too. What gets prioritized oftentimes when you're working on a browser at a browser company somehow benefits, it has to like roll up and benefit the company. Trying to implement CSS highlight inheritance, let's say, just for developers is often like, well, that doesn't show enough impact, or doesn't like, what's the business impact? And so in an ideal world, you'd have people just advancing the web forward without having to worry about the bottom line, the business impact.
But this sounds to me like a not-for-profit or a charity.
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard people say, "Oh, why doesn't the Linux Foundation take over Chromium?" But it's all well and good, but still somebody has to pay.
Yeah.
Developers don't get out of bed for free.
No. And I don't necessarily know that I have a good answer to that. In my talk, I mention alternative funding models, and some of them are some people aren't already thrilled about, but they're very like Web3 or cryptocurrency based, and that in itself has, ethical and environmental concerns. But the money has to come from somewhere, and so I don't necessarily know that I have a good answer, because it is such a huge task to try and undo this system that we are deeply integrated into. And how do you undo that without everything just sort of collapsing?
I agree. I mean, I'm slightly disappointed, but not surprised you didn't just have the answer, because I've been thinking about this for ages, and you are cleverer than me. But it's a Gordian knot, because I don't think that lawmakers in the American Congress, or even attorneys in the DOJ, have the technical understanding to resolve this.
Yeah.
But I don't know that anybody can resolve it without some sort of legislative or regulatory framework on which to hang any resolution. And that requires the lawmakers. We've been very lucky in the UK that the people who've been dealing with the browser ecosystem in the UK, there might be lawyers and economists, but they're really switched on with the technical stuff. I haven't necessarily seen that level of tech acumen in the US House, but maybe that's just because I'm unacquainted with Mr. Trump's knowledge of rendering engines. But I doubt it's particularly significant. And of course, the new lot coming in seem to make noises about being opposed to any kind of tech regulation anyway. So not holding out much hope.
The thing that scares me, like when I think about one other thing that continues to scare me in this conversation, is when I talk about like the internet and access to the internet being vital to our like it's infrastructure. And when I look at the way infrastructure in the US is cared for, like roads, the electrical grid, all of that, I'm just like terrified, because that's already not taken care of. And browsers are vital infrastructure, in my opinion. And I don't think many of the people in the government making these decisions understand that. And I almost wonder sometimes too if, so I don't think they understand that. But my hope would be, if someone did understand that, there would be a way to force tech companies to take some of this profit from advertising and say, you have to invest $1 billion over the next 10, 15, 20 years back into the ecosystem to make sure that not just browsers, but like other open source projects that are the backbone of many programs and other things that the government and uses, especially like making sure that those are maintained and healthy and people are getting paid to work on that. Because what happens if the banking system goes down because of I don't know. But
Yeah, it's such a problem, and it's weird because 30 years ago, that's before I got onto the web. I think I got involved in sort of 99 or something, but 30 years ago, the nerds, people like us, were celebrating that the internet was a place that was out of the reach of government regulation, and we were celebrating that. And the tech bros and the advertising boys and the data marketing collection people have effed it up so badly that now the nerds like us are actually begging for government regulation just to protect it. And
Mhm.
I blame the Silicon Valley people, or the equivalents of worldwide. It's not only the Bay Area. There are equally culpable people across the world who've just monetized and monetized and monetized it, but put comparatively little back and left it too big to fail, but also too big to divest almost. Oh
Yeah.
God. I'm really going to have to go back to bed and take a Valium or something now. Other sedatives are available, listeners. Stephanie, I've taken up loads of your time. I hope that when you come up with a definitive answer, you'll come back on here and tell us
Yes.
what it is. Are you giving the talk again, or a follow-up talk?
I would like to give the talk again. If anyone is listening who runs an event or a conference, I don't have anything scheduled for 2025, and I would very, very much like to give this talk again. And it will even be improved upon and updated because lots of things have happened since when did I give this? September? So it will be the same talk, but with new updates, so new content.
I've been giving a talk now for years called "Whose Web Is It Anyway?", which I talk about our fight with open web advocacy's fight with Apple, etc. And every time I give it, something's changed, so it never feels like the same talk twice. There's always an update for good or for bad. Thank you so much for taking time to talk to us.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for thinking the depressing thoughts. And please give Vivaldi's love to all your friends at Igalia. It's really great that somebody is actively contributing to all the 3 browser engines that are a bunch of hippies and not under corporate control. It's really good, and I wish more people knew, and I'll make sure I link to all the stuff about MathML and SVG and all the other stuff that Igalia is doing that we haven't had time to talk about. So I hope 2025 is great for you. I should always be indebted to you for being the woman who made me become Amish. So
Amazing.
have a great year. Have a great rest of your day, and thank you so much.
Thanks
Thank you for
so much.
listening, folks. Bye.